para a Bienal de Istambul, a 13ª Bienal de Istambul.
Uau!
E também para o Stereo Museum, e apresentado também pelo programa público do Stereo Museum. A Star, para quem não conhece, é uma artista e uma ativista, já com uma larga obra também de reflexão sobre estas questões, sobretudo do museu em contexto do pós-capitalismo. Portanto, tem tido um trabalho muito profícuo nesta área, como artista e como performer, mas também, sobretudo, em termos teóricos. Ela tem uma série de obras que aconselho vivamente e que refletem imensamente sobre vários quadrantes e várias perspectivas sobre o papel do museu numa sociedade pós-capitalista e das suas complexidades. Deixo-vos com o filme, espero que gostem e até já.
Is a museum a battlefield? Most will say, of course not. On the contrary, it is an ivory tower secluded from social reality. It is a playground for the 5%. If art is going to have anything to do with social reality whatsoever, then certainly not within a museum. So how could such a secluded and isolated place be a battlefield? And of what battle? But then, museums are of course battlefields. They have been throughout history. They have been torture chambers, sites of war crimes, civil war, and also revolution. Take the sequence in Eisenstein's seminal movie October, when Bolsheviks are storming the Winter Palace. What they are actually storming is a museum, namely the Hermitage Museum. We see how the crowds flood the museum and take the government prisoner. Yes, you might say, but today, in 2012, the situation is much different. I agree. But also, it is much less different than one might expect. The feudal art collections were established by wealthy patrons and aristocrats who put their wealth and taste on display. Today, art spaces worldwide, in emerging countries just as in former metropoles, are shifting back, or rather forward, to feudal modes again, turning into flagship displays of oligarch wealth and bubble money. This is a rendering I found online, plans by Rem Koolhaas' studio OMA to redevelop a part of the former Winter Palace into yet another Guggenheim franchise. So, to fast forward the story, is the battle inside the museum, is the revolution itself, is this a prelude to all-out gentrification? But we could also look at it from a different perspective, not from the perspective of the museum, which becomes a battlefield or not, but from the perspective of the battlefield. Does it have any link to, let's say, a contemporary art space, to a museum? And what would it look like? Let's take a look at one specific example. This is a battlefield in a mountain region south of Van.
أوا خروجيت نافذة جو أول قوتي أب خروجيتها وعسكري خروجي هو أويتها ملها هو وليدان يدفع مله هو أبراز ليدان جي دوري خستن دورا واش خج جرتبو يفرح جرن ویجا 10-15 کوبرا يعني 10-15 کوبرا و اوچا هاتن وليدان
This is where my friend Andrea Wolf is supposed to have been extrajudicially executed as a member of the women's section of the so-called PKK or Kurdish Workers' Party in 1998.
حوالا آلمان قوطه روناهی او بساخه گرفته بود بوده بود از قسطجیما yüz başı gopalek serda bu. Kurucu kontakat fekili da bu. Vakuştu bu. Dumahe çiçkete biri bu.
Alongside her, around 30 other people went missing and have never been seen again. So this event was never officially investigated or clarified, and after its location became public some 13 years later, a few colleagues and myself went to that place, and we were confronted with a, let's say, very standard, very small, very average battlefield. I guess there must be hundreds of them.
Aba batanya. Aba dasmala seri khoya. Aba parke kod.
Yes.
Aba khoji kho. Aba ta hammi shutikin ha.
And these all are of the bodies.
Aba chaydane wana, aba khosh khana.
And we know, and we can know that each is in Kurdish called shutik.
Aba jefi shekana.
And this, yes.
Aba shela.
Şöyle geriler. Şöyle var.
Aba jishela.
Oyun getirin.
Aba ta shutikin. Aba shutikin. Evet dana pişta khane. Aba hamma shutikin.
Her yek şu an şutki gel piştoğanına.
Her iki shutki aba
gelek. Yani mrovj bir deriz zone gelek hatim kuştum.
Ya suyuna insan ana kuştum.
Suyuna mrov hatim kuştum.
As you can see, I tried to follow back a few pieces of debris, back to their makers, back to their manufacturers, back to the places they were launched from initially. Take this bullet case, for example. This is a 20mm projectile made by a company called General Dynamics. It is shot from a gun which is called M197, a Gatling gun. And here's another one. This is a 7.62 millimeter cartridge shot from a G3 rifle made by Heckler and Koch, a German company. So I followed these and a few other pieces of scrap back to their makers, back to their manufacturers' headquarters in Western metropolises. And in the case of Lockheed Martin, which produces the Hellfire missile, which you saw, or which pieces of debris basically you saw in the video, it was very simple. So this is actually what the Hellfire looks like when hung from a Cobra helicopter. And So now look what Lockheed Martin's headquarters look like when seen from Google Earth, from above. This is the roof of Lockheed Martin's headquarters in Berlin. It's a perfect replica of the original missile. Just compare them. It's a perfect match. So this is when I realized that missiles, once they are fired, they can suddenly change their form. They suddenly transform in mid-flight into a piece of cutting-edge architecture designed by Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is the architect who designed the building in Berlin. So how is this possible? In this case, it's quite easy to understand because the software that Gehry Studio uses to produce these nicely rounded organic shapes is actually a version of the same software on which some of the Cobra helicopters were developed. So somewhere inside the software, some sort of bit flip happens and a missile suddenly transforms into a museum lobby. So the rocket actually is not only being fired across several countries, it is being fired, or basically it travels across several states of matter as well. It is fired as a missile, but somewhere in mid-flight it seems to hit a data cloud. And then it transforms into something else entirely. But let's go back to that 20 millimeter ammunition shell. So while following this specific 20 millimeter bullet backwards, I ended up in an even stranger place than with a Frank Gehry building in Berlin. Where do you think that was? Of course, inside a museum. And more precisely, inside the Art Institute of Chicago, which is designed by Renzo Piano. And even more strangely, I found this artwork in there. As you can clearly see, this is my own video called Abstract. Why did I end up in front of it? Because this institution is strongly supported by some members of General Dynamics' founding family. So let me recapitulate. I tried to follow the bullet backwards, towards its origin, towards the place where it was actually being fired from. And according to physics, if I do this, if I follow a bullet backwards, then I will somehow end up, presumably, with the person who fired it. So what did I find when I followed the bullet's trajectory backwards? I found a picture of myself actually shooting video on an iPhone with the caption, "This is a shot." So did I shoot the bullet I found on the battlefield myself? And there is something else I realized. This bullet I was following backwards towards its origin. It wasn't flying in a straight line, but it was rather flying in a circle. From battlefield to museum, and then back to battlefield again, and killing lots of people on its way. I didn't know such bullets existed, but apparently they do, and apparently the only person who is able to control such bullets is Angelina Jolie. In a movie called Wanted, she has been seen shooting bullets on a circular path, killing all the villains on her way, including, in the end, even herself. And this is being done, you know, by flicking the wrist when shooting the gun. And on the internet, you have lots of discussion whether this is actually possible or not. So let's come back to the real world, which is potentially even stranger. Let's look at this bullet, which I know you cannot see. It's invisible. This is what it looked like on the battlefield. But once it's removed and taken to an art space, it suddenly disappears and becomes invisible as if it had never been there in the first place. Indeed, all these things seem to exist under strange law of physics. So perhaps these bullets cannot even only fly in circles, but also in waves, or perhaps even in zigzag lines. Let's look at this diagram for a moment. It explains how some particles, like photons for example, if shot, could actually fly through two holes in a wall at the same time. If I understand correctly, they are shot, then they transform into a wave which goes through both holes in the wall at the same time. So perhaps the bullet I'm talking about hit a data cloud and then it spread out into a similar wave. Is this how a bullet flies both in a museum and a battlefield? Is this how a missile can be both a deadly weapon and a piece of architecture? Is this how it can transform into data, clouds, sculptures, gentrified neighborhoods, and all other sorts of unpredictable things? But let's focus the attention on the device which makes this strange double shooting possible in the first place, and this is the phone. Because, as you know, you cannot only shoot things with a phone, but also be targeted. You could get laser tagged and killed by a drone while making a phone call, which happened to many people within the last few years. But also, and much more likely, you could be targeted by customized spam. You could be on the most remote battlefield of the world and you would get some exhibition press releases or other customized form of online spam. For example, this. Look at this. This is a, let's say, very generic press release from the Royal Academy of Arts in London, sent by eFlux, which claims that British sculpture has a dialogue within a broader international context, and so on and so on. Anyway, the moment when I received it was this one, when I was sort of inadvertently pointing my camera at an ammunition case of a G3 rifle. Of course, this timing should have made me suspicious, because what happened is that a few months later, I found myself, of course, in front of the Royal Academy of Arts, because it was being sponsored and supported by the chairman of Heckler & Koch, who licenses such types of ammunition worldwide. And it occurred to me that the battlefield itself might have been at least partly modern British sculpture. As I said, the bullets tend to disappear from such exhibitions, but not entirely, as I found. Please look at this installation shot from modern British sculpture. So this work kept intriguing me, and I didn't know why, but then I finally found out. Look at this. The whole of the sculpture has a diameter of exactly 7.62 millimeters in the installation shot. Again, we are faced with the strange physics of bullets that pop in and out of art spaces, leaving holes occasionally materializing as art spam or starchitecture when being distracted by stray data clouds. We could even imagine Google glasses on whose half-mirrored surfaces art spam in form of exhibition press releases pops up next to drone strike craters. But let's come back to the question I raised earlier on. What do I actually see on this picture? What do I see on the phone? What is the countershot to this picture? Well, actually, I see you, or more generally, I see Istanbul Biennial. I see, for example, this pile of ammunition shells, which was put on display during the last edition of Istanbul Biennial. It is actually a quite wonderful artwork by an artist called Chris Martin. The name is Obusen too, and these seem to be 700 empty howitzer shells from World War I. I checked, but I couldn't find any precise caliber of that weapon. But wait, didn't I say that ammunition shells and bullet and things like that become invisible inside exhibition spaces? So these are clearly visible, and the reason is that they transformed into something else. They are not ammunition anymore. They have become artworks somewhere on the way. So in this case, we shouldn't ask who fired these shells, but who sponsored these artworks, and actually all the other artworks in the last 3 biennials, including this one. Here are some of the sponsors. So these are devices which are made or maintained or modernized by the sponsors of the 3 previous biennials editions, including Zolu Vestels, ISH, Thomson Tekfen-Radar, Coach Holdings, Ottokar, and formerly Siemens-owned Kraus Maffei Wegmann. So now I really reach the end of my amateur weapons knowledge. But any of you can go now and compare the caliber of the artwork to the caliber of sponsors' equipment, and maybe you will get a match. And then you'll know who sponsored which artwork. But these are only the empty shells. The grenades themselves have clearly been fired, and even if I don't know who sponsored them, I have seen where they hit, after probably flying in circles for a while and even backwards in time. They hit in battlefields like the one I showed you, killing quite a substantial number of people. And again, I find myself sitting in the space where the shooting originated from. But let me ask a more general question. A while ago, I started asking myself, what is the link between military conflict or invasion or civil war and the art market? How can we think about post-conflict art market booms fueled by gentrification and wild building activity? It has been remarked quite often that the recent art boom in Turkey has its roots in the explosion of business after the military coup of 1980, when union power was shattered and privatization was accelerated. As Baby Koch famously put it in a letter quoted in an admirable intervention to one of the last biennials, this happened by crushing, and this is a quote, the Communist Party, leftist organizations, Kurds, Armenians, end of quote, as well as labor unions, of course. But crucially, the explosion of the economy through liberalization was also echoed by very real explosions. So if you will, the same bullet shot in 1980 flew through 2 holes in the wall at the same time. One result was the explosion of the economy by privatization, and the other were very literal explosions by shells and missiles, not to mention mass displacement, mass disappearance, torture, and so on and so on. One bullet was shot, and as you can see, it hit in many different places. There is also another effect from this double shot, because everyone knows that if you are shooting a gun, there's a so-called recoil or kickback, a force which kicks you in your shoulder. So that means that the bullet may fly away, it may fly into circles or waves or zigzag lines or whatever, but the thing is that the kickback or the recoil also transforms the location you are shooting it from. So how would you know shots like this have been fired around you? This is very simple. If any such shots are fired close by, your neighborhood will be rebuilt by Frank Gehry, or Rem Koolhaas, or Zaha Hadid, or Nicholas Grimshaw. This is the kickback of any such shooting, and if you notice such building activity taking place around you, I suggest you throw yourself flat on your belly to take cover, because stray bullets may still be flying around that were not yet absorbed into Gehry's software. Look, in Zaha Hadid's master plan for Istanbul, the Kartal area, you actually see the bullet holes structuring the grid again. Look at this. This is a whole building which is composed by bullet holes. How do you construct anything like that? You put up a slab of Play-Doh or wet concrete or anything like that and just wait for a bullet which is flying in circles to hit it around 100 times. That's it. Building is ready. So, but to come back to the biennial and its sponsors, there was one of the sponsors which really caught my attention more than any other, and that was Siemens. Siemens was one of the biggest weapons manufacturers in Germany until last year, when they said that they had finally retired from this business, but it has also had a very consistent art funding for many years, and many of the shows I have participated in have been sponsored by this company. In the same period, though, their subsidiary Nokia Siemens developed an internet surveillance system that was sold to Syria, Iran, Bahrain, Yemen, and Egypt, and served to monitor all internet and phone communications. In Syria, for example, there were activists who had uploaded some videos of protests to YouTube. They were read transcripts of their online activities while being interrogated. In Bahrain, same thing happened to dissenters who were read their text messages while being tortured. In Iran, for example, police already was able to anticipate where gatherings were likely to happen, and then they sent in riot police before they even happened. And these systems are even able to secretly control the recording devices on your cell phones, meaning they can shut on or shut off cameras or microphones to surveil you on that. They can even change the contents of written transmission while it's being transmitted. And of course, they can also locate and track people depending on where they are through their cell phones. And of course, Siemens is not the only such company. Apple itself has developed a software that would allow it to remotely shut down the recording function of the iPhone, which could be applied, let's say, in any library or military facility or at any location of protest, so that they could disable any case of potential copyright infringement or even whistleblowing or documentation of state violence. Just look at Vodafone, another sponsor of the biennial, who has openly admitted surrendering all data of personal telecommunications to the British security services. So these tools are creating toxic data clouds, clouds that can potentially kill or damage people, clouds that are no less dangerous than those experimental tear gas clouds that people have been affected by lately in Turkey so many times. And these were preceded by mysterious and sometimes lethal chemical interventions on battlefields like the one I showed you. Indeed, in this place, there was the unmistakable presence of some chemical substance which caused real symptoms, establishing this battlefield as one of the many test sites for clouds used as weapons. But there's also another type of bullet. Look at this one. This originates from the weapons of the PKK militants on the same battlefields. These are actually ammunition cases from AK-47. It's just to complete the picture and not to pretend that militants were unarmed or that they did not shoot their weapons. I'm sure they did before they were captured and then executed and disappeared until this day, like thousands of others which have never been armed in the first place. But secondly, I think that one should also make the point that today every military organization is potentially an arts sponsor. It is of course difficult to know who exactly produced these weapons. No, AK-47 are the most pirated weapon in the world, and the situation got even more confusing after the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. So this is a list of potential manufacturers of these ammunition cases. They could be from Romanian, East German, Chinese, Yugoslav, Bulgarian, or Hungarian AK-47. It's very, very difficult to know who exactly produced them, but technically the patent still belongs to the Russian state. And if they get any money from it, which I actually doubt, they might as well use it to fund the Hermitage transformation into the new Guggenheim by Rem Koolhaas. So regardless of what you look at, sooner or later, you might end up in a museum, either with Team Gary, which is funded by the proceedings from G3 rifles, or with Team Koolhaas, which basically is funded by AK-47. It seems like we returned to the Hermitage in some sort of strange feedback loop. In any case, after I found myself in such loop, I made a decision. Rather than withdraw from such spaces because of their connection with military violence and gentrification, I would, on the contrary, try to show this video work in every single art space connected to this battlefield. I think if there's such feedback loop, I could also go ahead and try to reverse the direction just to see what strange physical effect might happen. To explain this, let me briefly show you another historical example. This is the Louvre in 1830, being stormed by revolutionaries. In fact, one could say that the Louvre was created by being stormed. The first time it was stormed was in 1792 during the French Revolution, and then it was turned from a feudal collection of spoils into presumably the first public art museum in the world. But it took a battle to create a public art museum, and actually it was a pretty violent battle too. In 1792, about 600 Swiss guards were massacred in the courtyard, and this is also why Swiss guards immediately ran away when it was stormed again in 1830, and the Louvre was stormed again in 1832, in 1848, in 1871, when it was completely burned down. This is what it took, not only to make it a public art museum, but also to keep it a public art museum. And up to this day, entrance is free for students for fear that otherwise they would burn it down again. So firstly, this shows that in order to have a public art museum, one has to storm it. And indeed, one could say that we are very lucky nowadays that so many private and corporate museums are being built. Just imagine the many opportunities we get to have public art museums. Just look at the Louvre to see how this worked. And look again today at its subsidiary in Abu Dhabi, designed by Jean Nouvel, to see how it goes feudal again and how this whole story is turning in circles too. But equally, one needs to also storm the clouds, which transform, bullets into art spam and reality into reality. How to do this? Of course, you have to go inside the cloud. And this is very simple. I mean, just take a picture of yourself to become data. Or you could even try a real tear gas cloud. I bet this would work as well. So take your mobile phone and choose the one function that's not so likely to be intercepted or disrupted or hacked or surveilled, and this is the torchlight. So now shine it against your hand. And now grab the invisible bullet that's been flying around since 1980, killing and disappearing lots of people on its way. And if you don't know how to do it, just take a lesson with Angelina Jolie. Could one perhaps reverse the direction of this bullet? Could one unkill the people that have died from it? And even if this is not possible, could we still unkill those that have, so to speak, not yet been killed by it? So now, with a flick of the wrist, curve the bullet the other way.